Hi there, Catherine, and hi, everybody. I'm about to share my desktop. So, Catherine, you should let me know if this works. My name is Harold Davis, and as Catherine said, I'm a professional photographer and writer. I've written many books, including Light and Exposure for Digital Photographers that O'Reilly published. I love giving this presentation because, A, as a professional photographer, it's not all that often that I get to show off my pictures of my kids, and B, because everybody wants to take pictures of their kids and family, whatever level of photographer one is. It's pretty much the one thing you have in common is that you want to take pictures of your kids, your families, and the weird things you see about you. So this is something that cuts across skill levels. If you're a professional, you're interested in doing it. If you're an amateur, you're also interested in doing it. So I've had a year where I had a new daughter who spent a lot of time in the hospital, and during this year when I've given presentations, I've gone into the room and they've said, hey, we really want to see your beautiful photographs of nature, but before we get there, how's your daughter doing? What's the story on your daughter? Well, with this presentation, I don't have to go there because my daughter's the star of it, among other stars, and that makes it really fun for me. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show a lot of photos here, and each time there's a photo, I'm going to talk a little about the technique of how the photo was made. And the hope there is that this will be something you can take back to your own photos, whatever kind of camera you're using, whether you have a point and shoot or a DSLR, whether you're shooting in RAW or JPEG. And as I do this, I'd like to encourage questions, because the way we learn how to photograph better is partly to talk about pictures we see and how they were made. So this is a photograph of my middle boy, Nicky, who was at the time I took the photo about 5.5 years old. And he was eating a chocolate sandwich, which may not be the most nutritious thing on earth to eat, but the moral of this photo is if you're going to photograph kids, let them do the things they enjoy doing in their way, and then they will show you something interesting about it. While the photographic moral also, which comes up again and again in pictures of kids, is be ready for action. If you hesitate, you're lost. You've got to be able to take a picture on the spot with kids, because in about 10 seconds they're going to be doing something else. In this case, the something else was throwing the chocolate sandwich down in disgust and saying, "I'm full, Dad." But that's the moral of that picture. Now this is a picture of my daughter Katie Rose, and fortunately she's doing very well after her stay in the hospital. It's a fisheye picture with the fisheye lens approximately 1/4 of an inch from her nose. I was lying on the ground on my belly as low as I could get. You can see in the background her mom looking down at this and laughing at us. The thing is that a number of people have looked at this photo and said that when Katie is 21, she's going to get her revenge on you by putting a camera with an extreme wide angle up against your nose as you're doddering around in a wheelchair. And there are people who think this is a funny image, and people who think that, well, maybe I'm making fun of my daughter and I shouldn't. And I had no intention of making fun of her here. I'm just sort of an image maker. So the moral of this story is get down on the level with kids, and don't be inhibited because you don't know what you're going to come up with. And these are my 3 boys, Matthew on the left, Julian in the center, who is dressed here as the Emperor Julian, and they're about to go out trick-or-treating, so these are Halloween costumes, and I had about 1 second to make this photo. So this one, the moral here is be ready. Set your ISO high enough that available light will do it for you, and be ready to press that button when you see them, because the chances of getting 2 expressions that are decent at the same time among 2 kids is pretty low, and when you add a 3rd kid to it, it's minimal, so when you see them, do it. I'm going to stop talking for a second and see if I can get any questions out of anybody.
Hey, Harold, no questions yet.
Okay, guys, ask questions, because that's what this is all about. It's about you just as much as me.
Okay, I'm sure we'll get plenty. So.
Good. Well, this is Nikki again, who you saw in the picture with the chocolate sandwich, and in this case, he's dressed in a costume that he said is the incredible alien monster. The a high ISO picture about ISO 1000. So moral here is don't be shy to shoot kids in low light. It works just fine. And watch out with that hair dye. It takes about 3 weeks to get out of their hair. Here's Katie again, the one from the fisheye lens and the arms of her pediatrician. Moral of this picture is take your camera everywhere.
Hey, Harold, I'm going to interrupt you because you don't mind that.
Nope.
One person is asking you to please talk a little bit about ISO, and another, Mary, wants to know what kind of equipment you're using for this.
Okay, let's start with the equipment. I use a Nikon digital SLR. I have a bunch of them, but mostly I'm using a D300 right now. And I, for general purposes, I use a 18 to 200 millimeter vibration reduction zoom lens. That's a pretty commonly in use lens. It's not a special piece of equipment. I mean, this is high-end prosumer equipment, so it's nothing out of the reach of a lot of people. But you know, I'm not an equipment hound. The right camera to use is the one you have with you when it's time to take a picture. There are a whole bunch of great $200, $300, $400 cameras. Like the Canon G10 is one of them that take great pictures from the viewpoint of kids with nice zoom lenses, with vibration reduction, with high-quality sensors that will get you images that are just fine for this kind of thing. Sensitivity is what you dial it into the camera. With film, it used to be called ASA or ISO then too, and it says how sensitive to light your exposure is. The higher the ISO, the darker you can take the shot in. The deal, though, is that you begin to get unfortunate artifacts and noise in it as you dial the ISO up too much. If you're using a point and shoot and don't know what ISO is, that probably means the camera's been setting it for you. And as you experiment with it, I suggest beginning to take control of ISO yourself and not letting the camera do that, because it doesn't necessarily know what is satisfactory and what isn't satisfactory. And generally, if you want to get a really fine result of something that you're going to blow up to be a 40 by 50 inch print, which happens to some of my work, you'll want to shoot it at a low ISO, 50, 100, 200, something like that. However, for this kind of photography, an ISO of between 500 and 1,000 usually works just fine and gives you a lot more leeway about how fast you can operate and about whether or not you need a flash, because as opposed to film photography with digital, I pretty much recommend turning the flash off. And that's a somewhat controversial standpoint, but with the ability of the recent generation of sensors to capture things in higher noise environment, there's really not much you need the flash for. And flash gives you the issue of red eye. There's some things you can do about that, which I can talk about if people are interested. But it also is disruptive. When you flash it at somebody, they're blinded for a second, everybody else is blinded, and you get a really harsh, direct light on your subject. It's important to observe the light around where you're going to be taking the picture before you even start to do it, because that way, when your subject moves into light that's really nice, you can be ready to take it. It's one of the things that you're looking for along with those nice expressions.
Okay.
Okay, well, you know, sometimes... Go ahead, Catherine.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to say there were a few questions about what range of lenses were best and how do you deal with flash and babies, and I think that you answered all of those questions.
Yeah, let me talk about
Okay.
the lens range. Let me talk
All right.
about both those issues
Okay.
a little bit more, though. You know, what I really like for photographing kids is a moderate telephoto lens. Something in the maybe 85 to 120 range, because that way you can't get so far away from the kid that way that you're not connecting with them, because one of the secrets of photographing anybody, kid, adult, Martian, is you have to connect with them. If there's no human connection between the photographer and the subject, then the photograph is dead. So you want to be able to connect with them. At the same time, you want to be able to not be in people's faces usually. So for the most part, that's what I use when I'm photographing kids. On the other hand, sometimes for special effects like that fisheye of Katie at the beginning, your special effects lenses are nice. Yes, there are some health concerns with flashing at babies. For example, you don't want to be using a flash in a hospital simply. As I said, my philosophy of photographing kids is the same as mine for adults. You have to connect with the person that you're dealing with. They're not just a subject. And you also want to do it in sort of a Star Trek non-interference principle. You don't want to do something that is going to be so obnoxious or disruptive that the subject starts to hate you. And that comes back to one of the other themes underlying this presentation, and that is that the photography of kids and family is something that's supposed to be fun. And it's not only should it involve the subject in helping you to plan it, but it also should be something that they don't see you as this awful person coming from outside and disrupting. I mean, I've been able to photograph in places, including hospitals and schools, with my kids and other kids that if I were obnoxious about it and banging off a flash all the time, no one would ever have let me. However, just to prove that there is no such thing as a rule all the time, this is a direct flash picture of Nikki at about age 3 taking a bath in the kitchen sink. I guess the low light conditions there, I said, okay, I'll just bang it out with the flash. What I do typically when I do that is I don't use the flash that's on the camera. I use a synced flash handheld off the camera up high, so the light isn't quite as harsh as it is when it's coming straight from the camera. And the same thing here. As you can see, there's a bit of a red eye in this one, but the situation was such that this is Matthew here, that I just could not resist going, okay, bang, here I am. And the reason that there is red eye here as opposed to the other one is that my flash was direct on the camera and I just pressed the button. I didn't have a lot of time to think about it. On the other hand, with a situation like this, with Nicky in his bike helmet inside a playhouse, I was able to talk to him to get his cooperation, to get down on his level, and I would never consider using a flash for something like this. This is a relatively calm, interactive kind of image, which is really what I prefer. Then again, you can see that as the father of 3 boys, my life is not always serene, and it's very hard when you're talking about family portraits to say, okay, how am I going to do this so we're all portrayed nicely, so you might as well just relax and forget about it. The thing I think is really important is that I've seen families where they make the family portrait this ritual and ordeal, and the kids are, oh God, Dad's taking out his camera again. You don't want it to be like that. You really just want it to be fun, and if it gets to be too laborious, you just move on. So I'm going to move on from the kids, though we'll come back to them, to some of the other weird things that I like to photograph, because I carry my camera with me, and it's kind of a diary of what I'm looking at and what I care about. And so if I see something beautiful, I photograph it. This one back here is a butterfly that I photographed on a light table looking down on it, and then I went into Photoshop and painted it. And so I love to photograph butterflies, dragonflies, colorful insects generally. These are elk out on the Point Reyes Peninsula at night. And what I did was I put the camera on a tripod and I held it open for about 2 minutes. And that's why the light on them was moonlight, and that's why there's this interesting sort of motion effect. This is a Metropolitan, a car from the 40s that was in the morning light. Well, I guess I was dropping kids off at school. I saw this car. I said, I have to photograph this. And I set up the tripod and quickly took the picture. Now, definitely the extraterrestrial highway, Highway 375 in Nevada, qualifies as another weird thing. This is depending upon how you look at it, is the biggest case of red eye in the world, or it's also a poppy bud. These are drops of sky on a leaf in the morning in my garden. And we come back to kids. This is Katie in a bathtub with double chins. Okay, so what do we do with all these photos? This is a picture of the photographer Jay Mizell in a huge bathtub of Kodachrome slides back in the 1980s. It's not 100% clear that the situation's much better today with digital photography, because we take these tons and tons and tons of pictures, at least I do, and what do we do with all of them? Well, one thing I do with them is I don't throw any of them away. I archive them. This presentation can go a couple of ways here. It depends upon the level of interest of the audience, but I can talk about what my digital asset management scheme is in a fair amount of detail, or we can kind of move on. But it's important to note that there's no really good way to archive digital imagery on media that anyone at this point in time knows will be permanent. If you burn them onto a disk, you've got maybe 10 years of guaranteed life. So actually the best archival thing you could do with an image you really care about right now is make an archival quality print, put it in a drawer, or put it behind UV glass with acid-free framing, and that'll probably last 100 or 200 years. Otherwise, you've got to think about things that are more information technology oriented than art oriented. How do you actually save these things, let alone the question of how you find them when you want them, how you go through them, how you tag them, how you search them. It's actually a big problem for a professional photographer, and it trickles down to amateur photographers as well. I've heard stories of people who shoot memory cards full of photos of their kids and other weird things, and eventually just give up and delete them. One suggestion I have is to understand that the memory card inside your camera is just a storage device. You don't need to use the software that the manufacturer of the camera supplies. You can plug it into a card reader, into the USB or FireWire port on your computer, and just copy and deal with the images as though they are computer files that can be placed into folders. And it's probably a much saner thing to do that than to expect the software that comes with the camera to manage your pictures for you. If you're using a piece of software like Adobe's Lightroom, that's another story. That does a pretty good job of cataloging and maintaining files for you. Are there any questions on this topic, on digital asset management?
Harold, we have a lot of questions coming in. There were some that went by quickly about the slides that you just, the close-ups that you showed, the water on the flowers and et cetera. But do you want to take those? Or
sure, I'm
people are
happy to.
asking about digital asset management too. And
well, let's start with a couple on the close-ups and then move to the digital asset management.
Okay, a couple people were asking, did you use macro on the close-up shots?
Yeah, I absolutely. If by macro one means macro lenses, I do. I wish I could collect every lens in the world, because lenses are or at least every lens that has a Nikon mount in the world, because lenses are a photographer's paintbrush, really. And they all have different characteristics. It's a kind of slightly dirty secret of the camera hardware industry, that every single lens is different. It's like, if you buy a car that's a lemon because whoever was making it had too much beer that day. Well, there are lenses of the same model lens that are really good, and other ones of the same thing that are not so good. But I have a collection of macro lenses. My favorite two are a 200 millimeter macro lens, so it's a fairly big telephoto macro lens. It's a heavy manual clunker. And another heavy manual clunker, 100 millimeter macro that Carl Zeiss makes, that uses the same optics that are used in some movies. And it's it's a completely manual lens, no autofocus, no tie-in with the camera's computer, and it's got a really nice, hugely graduated hand focus so that I can focus it very carefully. What I also use to help me do that, because it's a bit of a tough process on my aging eyes, is I use a magnifying eyepiece usually when I'm doing a careful macro shot.
And is that the lens that you used on the dewdrops?
Yeah, no, I think the dewdrop was the 200 millimeter f4 Nikkor that I mentioned.
Okay, all right. And then here's a question you may want to address later.
Let me just say one other thing about macros. I mean, I mentioned some fairly heavy-duty equipment here, but it's actually possible to take macros without that. An inexpensive close-up filter works pretty well with a DSLR, and if you have a point-and-shoot camera, the macro mode in those are actually astoundingly good. You can take some really nice macro pictures with very simple equipment. A tripod, however, is pretty essential.
Right. And then I think you may want to address this question later. Jay is asking, how much adjustment in Photoshop RAW tweaking do you do on portraits versus your landscapes? I mean, you can answer it.
Well, that's a very good question. Mm-hmm. And in fact, all the questions so far have been good questions.
Oh, they're good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. First of all, my philosophy is that a digital photo is one part photo and one part digital software, and both parts are important. This goes for all the work I do, whether it's landscape or portraiture. That's not to say there's any excuse for being a sloppy photographer. You want to start with the best capture you can make given the circumstances, but I almost always work my images afterwards and post-process them. What I do with portraits is a little bit different than what I do with landscapes or flowers, because I don't feel I have as much license exactly. Skin tones are skin tones, and if you start I was going to say screwing around with them too much, but how to put it more nicely, you want to keep them looking natural and more or less the way people look. That said, nobody wants to have a portrait of them taken with showing yellow teeth or a lot of zits or things like that. So there's some cleanup that people expect, particularly when you're a professional photographer and you do a portrait. That's just part of the territory. There's a balance there. Then again, it's nice to tell the truth about people also. And if your portraits of people don't have some semblance of truth, then it shows, and that's not good. So I routinely do some smoothing of wrinkles. That, of course, doesn't come up much with kids. What I also routinely do is I work on the highlights in the eyes. That's just part of what I do. And that's a process in Photoshop of magnifying the eyes, adding a layer to them, and then seeing where the natural highlights are and just making them maybe 10% bigger. Because somehow there's something about seeing that sparkle in somebody's eye that people really respond to in photos.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Question.
And so about digital asset management, you are just being encouraged to talk about it as much as possible, about workflow and storing. And then Yazid asked if you use iPhoto to archive your photos or another application like Aperture.
Okay, good questions. I do not use iPhoto. I use iPhoto to make slideshows. I do not use another application like Aperture or Lightroom, although both Aperture and Lightroom have some very good archiving capabilities. What I do is I go out there, I shoot a couple of hundred pictures on my memory card. I shoot them in RAW format. I copy the RAW format onto my Mac's hard drive into a folder. That I try to have 3 copies of every file at all times. I only delete things that are obviously terrible, that are black or just for some reason along those lines not acceptable. I have network attached storage boxes that a company called Buffalo makes that are 5 terabytes each. These are RAID 5 boxes, so they've got some redundancy. I use 2 of them so that means I have about 4 times backup for each file. What I do is after I've got this on my hard drive, I do a local backup on an attached USB drive, and then month by month I copy a catalog over to the network attached storage boxes. I do it chronologically by year, by month, with a subject tagging on the outside. So that lets me find my master files relatively quickly. What I then use to sort of give me and art directors who want to find my work, which are perhaps more important to me than me, the ability to look through my work is for each session where I really do something, I pretty much always upload an image to Flickr, a low resolution JPEG to Flickr. And Flickr lets me tag them so I can find them, and I can search by shoot date and upload date there as well. And then the items that go on Flickr go onto my blog, photoblog2.com, and from there I have a Google full text search of all the blog stories that go with the pictures. So between all that searching stuff, I can pretty much always find the shoot date or upload date for an image, and then I can go back to my catalogs on the RAID 5 network attached storage and find the master if I need it. Because what I do find is that almost every time one of my images is used for publication, there's some wrinkle about how I prepare it. It has to be in this format or that format at 350 dpi, at 400 dpi. And what often is the case is that people want really large files for critical reproductions. So are there more questions about digital asset management?
Yeah. Kelly's asking, is there a reason that amateur photographers shouldn't use iPhoto or Aperture for storage?
Kelly, a good question. I mean, first of all, anybody who uses anything is better off than 98% of the amateur photographers out there who don't use anything. So I say if you take Aperture or iPhoto and you like the interface and you can work with it, go ahead, go to town. There are some reasons why, for mission-critical kinds of uses, the idea of having all the stuff controlled by a program with a database controller that that isn't owned by you exactly may be something one might want to think about. But on the whole, I would totally encourage you to go for iPhoto or Aperture, or Lightroom, by the way, too.
Okay.
It's a good solution.
Good. Now, this is not about digital asset management, but Keith has asked it twice, so I'll run it past you. His question is about a specific scenario using a Canon 50D, which has a smaller sensor, I think 1.6 magnification. He says, if they're laying on your bed and you're next to them, what lens would you use, since your close focal range is a factor, like laying on the bed next to a child and wanting to photograph it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, and it's a real-world situation. The small sensor size is not all that relevant, but the smaller the sensor, the more depth of field you have, actually. So having a small sensor size is not such a terrible thing. In this case, I mean, So you need a lens that focuses close enough to actually get to get your subject. Presumably you want at least the child's face and maybe more. So you're almost certainly going to be having to use a wide-angle lens here, which will also increase the depth of field. What you have to try to do here is you have to try to pre-visualize the effect you want. It's very different to have a photo that shows the kid's eyes and nose in focus and nothing else. Everything else is blurry, because you could shoot something like that wide open. However, if you want everything to be in focus for a high depth of field image, then you need to stop the lens down to, f16 or f22 or however low it goes for maximum depth of field. To achieve that, you're at a reasonable shutter speed where you're not going to get motion shake. You need to up the ISO quite a bit, and that may involve some subsequent noise processing and post-processing if you have to do that. So you kind of work back. The process is I look at the situation. In my head, I say, this is the picture I want to come up with. You then say, what tools do I need to do that, and then what settings to use. So, I don't really have quite enough information with the kid on the bed. I need to know what the picture is that I want to end up with. My gut is that you're looking at a real wide-angle lens as the way to go here, probably something like something in the 14 to 18 millimeter range. Does that help?
Yeah, and he said that it's a headshot. He's looking for a headshot, close-up headshot. But
well, then you don't
that
want to.
That does help.
yeah. Then you don't. It depends also how far away you can get. I mean, then you don't want such a wide-angle lens, because there is another issue, and that is that moderate telephoto lenses are very flattering on the with the planes of a face. So, if possible, if you're looking for a flattering headshot, you want to use a moderately long lens, not a wide-angle lens, because as we've noted, wide lenses do weird things to people's faces.
And which did you use for this snake?
Yeah, let me just quick run through these. On other weird things, we've got little animals. This is a Steller's blue jay, and I photographed this in a snowstorm up at Yosemite when I was with my older son, and my older son was half on purpose dropping barbecued potato chips, so that's why this bird was hanging around so closely. If you look at the picture, you can see some of the potato chips, which I appreciated. I photographed this with a Pentax point-and-shoot waterproof camera, which was the only thing I could take outside in the wet snow, and this is a this is a demonstration that you can get some pretty sharp results with point-and-shoots. This is a coyote. This is a hummingbird's tongue here, which many people don't know that hummingbirds eat more than their own weight in aphids and other little insects with their tongue besides nectar. This is a salamander, and I used a telephoto macro lens to focus on this, on the eyes here with very low depth of field.
Wow.
This is the Serpent Mother, a art piece that a group of women in the Bay Area produce and take to various places.
Nice.
And this photograph here shows multitasking. There we go. There's the multitasking photo.
He's not going to like you for that.
You think it's worse than the fisheye Katie?
I don't know. I don't know.
I just couldn't resist. I mean, this was his setup. He said, "Hey, Dad, I have to go." And I said, "Okay." And he said, "Oh no, I need to keep playing." I said, "All right."
Well, at least his face isn't in there, so.
There you go. So part of what I like to do in my photographs of weird things that are not people is to change them, to transmogrify them, to make them things that they're not, to make a double take. So here are a few double takes. So this was Katie's pacifier, actually in the hospital, and the object here that I had was to photograph this common object and make it something that's interesting. These are seagull feathers on the beach.
beautiful.
This is a photograph of a turkey feather through a microscope. The Art Museum in San Francisco, from the roof, again with a point and shoot, because they don't let you take tripods in there, so that's a sort of lowest common denominator enforcement. All you're going to be able to do is what you can do with your eyes there.
So Patricia's asking if you can explain the technique associated with the photos, if possible.
Well, you know, I could spend a good question. I could spend the entire presentation explaining the technique on almost any single one of these photos. Mm-hmm. But the issue here is that with this photo, and I'll try to talk a little bit more about it as I go along. But you have a very expansive rooftop. That's what's in the background. I think it's Frank Gehry who designed it. And in the front, you have the sort of textured stubbled porch that comes off the tower on top of the building. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to get both in focus so that you weren't quite sure of what plane you were looking at here. So to do that, I put the camera onto aperture preferred metering, and I stopped it down as far as it would go. And as noted, this was a point and shoot with a small sensor, a Canon G9, and they have high depth of field, even at f8, which is as far down as they go because of the smaller sensor size. So that's really all there was to the technique here, besides a compositional issue to say, okay, this is interesting looking because it looks like something else.
Yeah.
This is a shot of traffic on the Golden Gate Bridge at dusk, and it's about a 10-second exposure, camera on tripod, telephoto lens from directly opposite the entrance. The technique here is to hold the shutter open long enough so that the motion starts to streak and to become interesting. And then when that happens, what you're getting is patterns of light. So you need to repeat the process and/or wait until you see patterns of the traffic moving that will make their lights make interesting patterns as opposed to uninteresting patterns. What I like about this image is that it's a little bit hard to tell the scale if you don't look at it very carefully. This is a stadium looking up the path of the stadium. And
Charles,
yeah.
Charles, where were you standing when you took that Golden Gate Bridge shot?
I was standing on a promontory above Sausalito.
Okay, I know where that is.
This is a shot of a mesh curtain with some holes in it where I was sitting, and I was just sort of sitting there holding one of my kids for a while, and I looked at it and I said, you know, that's interesting the way the trees go through that. Let me photograph it. And then the trick was to try to stop it in motion and at the same time get high depth of field.
You know, that takes me to another question that people have been asking about how you're always ready to take these photos. And do you take a camera and tripod everywhere? And how do you keep them set to capture these great action photos and other photos?
Very, very good questions. I mean, first of all, I do take a camera and a tripod a lot of places, enough to drive my family crazy. I mean, to quote Jay Mizell, who I showed in the bowl of Kodachrome slides earlier, he said, I like to carry my camera with me all the time because it's hard to take a photo without a camera. So I do carry cameras around a lot, and I also have the habit of setting them so they're ready for what I think the situation will be. That means when I'm through shooting, I return them to programmed automatic, and I set the ISO, and that way, you know, the truth is that I don't use program automatic very much in my shooting, but on the other hand, if you pull the camera out of the bag and the subject is right there, and you press the button, you're going to get something, and that's much better than having it set to manual where you likely won't. The prepared mind is partly the answer here. I mean, that goes along I'm not going to say that my photos have the quality of decisive moment that somebody like Henri Cartier-Bresson had, but good photos do have this sense that whoever took them was ready for what would happen. So I try to be prepared and to pre-visualize as much as possible what is the mode for taking the pictures. And sometimes in my life I'm not a photographer, I'm just a dad or whatever else I'm doing, and then I don't have a camera with me. But when I do have a camera with me, I'm thinking about photography, and I also actively engage people, kids, people around me, in helping to make photos as well. Do we have anything follow up on that?
Well, about the mesh, the black and white mesh, how did you get that picture?
That's actually a composite of about 5 images that I set the camera on a tripod, and I sat there for maybe an hour, and I took a bunch of images, and then I combined the sharpest elements of each.
Okay.
And I also varied the focus so that I could extend what would otherwise have been in focus. That's an interesting point, is that there's a fair amount of talk about high dynamic range images that you can do with digital photography, and there are a bunch of different techniques for doing high dynamic range photos. You can use an automated software program called Photomatics to combine a variety of exposures together, or you can also do it by hand, which is what I tend to prefer. But what people don't realize that much is you can also do the same thing with focus. If you shoot a whole bunch of images at a different focal point and you want to get something that's sharper than it would normally appear on optics, you can also do that by combining the images.
Okay, but you didn't do that with your son looking through the chocolate sandwich.
No, I did not. That's, of course not. I mean, I don't mean of course.
Yeah, it was the entire picture was so...
Well, actually, we could go back and look at it, Catherine, but I think if you did, you'd see that what's really sharp there is his eye.
Okay.
And the rest of it isn't so sharp. And that's a good point. What people look to be sharp in pictures of people are the eyes. So if you're going to focus on one thing about a person, focus on their eyes.
Okay, someone was asking about that earlier. So
that's a very good question and a very important point. The eyes are what people look at, and if you get the eyes sharp, they'll forgive lots of other things not being quite so sharp.
Okay, so what is this image?
This is a pot in the kitchen.
No way.
Stove.
I thought this was a painting.
Well, it's also a painting, so you're not so far wrong. But,
okay.
But the photo itself is a big pot with reflections in it. Here's another version of the same thing. And there's the photo that I made. The first 2 were paintings from this. So you can see what you've got is a scratched up but rather respectable and well-used pot in our kitchen with reflections of other pots in our kitchen in the background.
Nice.
This is a mirror in a hairdresser's. I was just sitting around there watching the kids get haircuts, and I saw this thing, and art is where you find it.
Yeah.
This is looking up in the Marin Center, Frank Lloyd Wright's building that is the municipal offices, performance center, and everything for Marin County. And this is a fisheye shot. I looked up, fisheye shot, camera on tripod, pretty long exposure because it was pretty dark in there. The inside is 3 floors going up in the dome, and I looked at that and I said, this looks like a dragonfly to me. Mm. The wings of the dragonfly are one of the main doors to the Marin Center.
And Harold, you use Photoshop for your post-processing, is that correct? You shoot in RAW whenever possible and use Photoshop.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. I've experimented also with some specialty processing programs like Photomatics that I mentioned, but I pretty much always end up coming back to Photoshop. And a point there is that I spend more time processing my images than I do actually shooting them. And I say to people that that almost every image I've ever taken takes me at least an hour to process. afterwards in the Photoshop darkroom. And you know, I get a certain amount of, oh my God, you really spend the time doing that? Well, first of all, I love doing it. I find it very relaxing. And secondly, it's like if somebody were a painter and they said, okay, I spend an hour doing a nice painting, people wouldn't think that's over the top. They'd think that's a reasonable amount of time to spend doing a painting. So that's kind of my attitude. If I get one really decent picture a day and it takes me an hour or so to do that in Photoshop, I'm happy. I like shooting and I like working afterwards on photos, and I think digital photography is at its best when the two are combined together. This is a photo here of a swimming pool railing, and what the reflections in the railing are what intrigued me, but I did use the technique that I mentioned of focusing on multiple points here. There are 5 points of focus that I combined here.
Okay. So someone was asking this, and I think it applies to this. How did you avoid getting your reflection in the pot that you took, and again the swimming pool? How do you keep
Here's
your
the
reflection?
Pot.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, there really are a good question. There are two answers there. One is use a long lens, okay? Mm-hmm. Because with a long lens you can back away. Okay. And two is it's a question of angle.
Yes. Okay. I always wondered that when I
And in fact, in this picture of the pot, it's an interesting question. In this picture of the pot, I'm pointing my mouse at the part of me that you can see. You can see part of my tripod right here.
Oh, I see. I wouldn't have noticed that.
Right.
Okay. Excellent. Eric is asking, when you say that you spend an hour to process an image, are you referring to going through all the images that you've taken or just one particular photo?
No, that's per photo, and it's probably conservative. I probably spend more than that on most photos.
I bet you do. I bet you do.
Yeah.
And then about focusing on the eyes, do you focus and then recompose on the eyes, or do you back focus? Iris is asking, what's the best way to focus on the eyes?
The way two porcupines make love, very carefully. No, it's a good question. It's harder to do than meets the eye, particularly so to speak, particularly with kids who are constantly moving. I tend to do what I think she suggested, and that is I focus on the eyes, I get my point of focus, I hold the point of focus, and then I recompose the picture. I find that tends to work best, but you know, my DSLR also has a mode where it's got variable focus points and will do autofocus for you. I mean, I think I'm not a total fan of autofocus. I think I've lost more pictures from autofocus than it's made for me, but I do use it a lot, of course. And what you can do with autofocus is with this variable mode of autofocus, is you can set the focus point to where you know the eyes are going to be in the picture, and then let it do it for you. And that sometimes works pretty well depending upon the light conditions. If your subject is going to cooperate with you and stay still, it's obviously fairly easy to focus on the eyes. But if they're not, well, you just have to have good reflexes.
Okay.
This is Matthew here, and his eyes are pretty clearly focused on.
Yeah.
And there he is again, and once more the eyes are the point of focus. Another point here is that one thing that really helps with pictures of anybody is a framing mechanism in your composition. If you can set up a situation where you've got something surrounding the child or person, it tends to make for a more interesting composition than just the kid in a vacuum, or worse, the kid with all the clutter of one's life behind them, although that could be interesting in its own right too. But what I try to do is I try to get some kind of situation where there's framing, where there's a door or a window or an interesting context. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a pseudo Polaroid frame with a Groucho Marx set on, although that's not bad either.
No.
This is another side of my life, I did a book about Yosemite a couple of years ago, and that involved taking a whole bunch of winter trips to Yosemite Valley, and I tried to take my oldest son with me as often as I could. So I would be photographing, for example, here from Swinging Bridge above the Merced River, and I'd be spending like an hour or two composing the picture and getting it set and so on. And Julian would be playing down by the banks of the river and making snowballs and getting himself thoroughly wet and being very happy. And so I decided it was worth taking a picture of him too to show the kind of background. And there he is, happily being in the snow. This is a telephoto shot at about 1,000th of a second of Julian on a trapeze. And with this one, yeah, basically it's like I saw his trajectory. I knew when I had to take the picture. I focused on the spot he was going to be on, and when he was there, I snapped it.
Wow.
It's great to put babies in baskets, and that gives them a container or a frame in the way I talked about before. Again, focus on the eyes. If they're making funny faces, it's probably a good thing for a photograph anyhow. And there's a fisheye version of Julian. And there's a Katie being a pirate. And this picture perhaps says that focus isn't everything, because if you look at it, it's actually not all that sharp in the key spots. But I thought the Arg me Hardy's expression with the hat was funny enough to make up for technical deficiencies. Now, I have a very forgiving spouse because she puts up with me even though I take pictures like this. And this is another framing device for Matthew, because there he was coming out of this tunnel, and the circular spiral effect of the tunnel in on him makes the photo more interesting than it would otherwise be, and it kind of relates to the character of this child also, who is someone who is just always pushing to get through things, and he's passionate, let's get it done kind of guy. Yeah.
The photo of your wife and your daughter, when you have more than one subject, who do you focus on? It looks like the daughter, yeah.
In this case, really the subject here is the daughter.
Uh-huh.
Okay, I mean, you don't tell your wife that, but it's true, and she would even think that too. And so, if you look at it, the focus is actually on Katie's eyes here. Phyllis is slightly out of focus. Maybe in the best of all worlds, you might want to be able to get both in focus. So I don't think so. I think probably if you did that, then the background would be sharp too, and it wouldn't have as much depth and interest. So the answer really is the baby is always the focus.
Okay.
Unless you're, I don't know, some star or something, and it's a publicity shot with you, and your kid's a fashion accessory. But otherwise, everybody more or less knows that the baby is what counts.
And you said that you will go in and you'll magnify the highlights in the eyes. Do you ever add them if there aren't any there?
Well, how can I put? It's a good question. I wouldn't put that beyond me. I mean, I have I have no moral compunctions about doing it. It's dangerous, however, because if you're going to do that and it's not going to look hokey, you need to have a good idea of where the highlights ought to be coming from. And the best way to see where they ought to be coming from is to see what's there. Okay. If there are no highlights in it, how do you know where they ought to be? And if you just start painting them in, maybe they're going to look pretty weird.
Right.
Now, let's say also that what I always do in Photoshop when I paint highlights on somebody's eyes is I do a duplicate layer. So I'm painting on a duplicate. If I don't like the effect, or, hey, it's good, but it's a little bit too much, it's totally easy to take it down or to go back. I never do that in a destructive way, and I always do it in a way where I can mitigate the effect if it's too much.
Okay. And when you're shooting outside, like playgrounds and beaches with bright skies, do you use a very high shutter speed, like 1,000?
Well, I mean, that probably yes is the answer to that question, but it depends on a few more variables. I mean, you really probably being able to use a high shutter speed in that kind of situation is nice because particularly if your subjects are kids in a playground, they're going to be in motion, so you want to be able to stop the motion. This again comes back to the issue of pre-visualization. Probably the key skill a photographer has to develop is the ability to see in advance what the pictures are going to come out like. I mean, it might just be that I might be sitting on a playground bench and have this idea of how wonderful to have a picture of a kid jumping where there's this motion blur. And then I would know that if I shot a picture at a 30th or a 15th of a second, I could capture detail in a face, but at the same time, the legs would have a trailing blur because that's what that shutter speed does to motion. So it kind of just depends, basically. But yeah, probably I would be looking for a 500th or a 1,000th of a second in outdoor photography. This is a photo of Katie about a month after she was born, still in the hospital. And there's her little hand at about the same time holding on to her mom's hand.
Amazing.
And shortly after she came home. So if we are people who love photography and we spend a lot of time taking photos, it's important that our photos mean something to us, the people around us, our families, friends, and kids do. And I'd encourage everyone who loves photography to focus on, in the best sense of the word, what's meaningful to them. Why are you taking the picture? What's it about? Why do you care?
Good. That's a night photo.
Excuse me?
Is that one of your night photos?
Which one?
The tree.
This? No. No. It's a foggy day.
Okay. Oh, beautiful.
I shot this by the light of a 15-watt light bulb at a high ISO, because that's where she was. She was sleeping, and I wasn't going to disturb her. But then I said, hey, that's really a beautiful light. It's kind of almost a Rembrandt chiaroscuro. And instead of saying, okay, let me process the noise out of it, I said, let me take this noise, and I passed it through Photoshop's film grain filter, and I sort of made a intentionally grainy effect out of it.
Beautiful.
So if you have a point-and-shoot, and you've looked at the exposure modes on it, you may have noticed all these totally bizarre modes: sports mode, wedding mode, pet mode. Mostly those are meaningless. The real modes that matter are fully programmed automatic, aperture preferred, shutter preferred, and manual. And basically you should get in the habit of thinking of camera modes that way. I mean, the only point in putting something in sports mode is because, hey, what that really is that's shutter preferred mode with as fast a shutter speed as possible. Landscape mode really means, okay, this is going to be a moderate exposure and we're not going to use a flash. So what the camera manufacturers have done is they've put together these modes and tried to make people think that they're meaningful in some way, but for the most part they're really not. There's so many icons on the touch screens on the back of the cameras, and it's really smart to begin to learn how to use both aperture preferred and manual metering, because those are effective use of those modes is really a lot of the key to good photography from a technical viewpoint. And again, with this picture, I knew that I needed to exposed for the light on Katie's face, and that was a lot brighter than the surrounding scenery. So one way I could have got there was by spot metering on the center of her on her face. But what I did was actually I had the camera on manual, and I just underexposed by about 2 f-stops, by a factor of 4, for the overall light on the scene. And it's the same kind of deal here with this macro. That's a water drops on a leaf petal. The real issue here is I wanted to be sure to expose properly for the lit areas, and I didn't care that much about the rest of the stuff. With what's called a high-key photo like this, one of this anemone, the name of the flower here, what you have to do is you have to overexpose, or at any rate, the camera is going to regard what you want to do as overexposure. If you take a straight average meter reading of something like this, the camera that the camera has, it's going to produce a sort of harsh image. It's going to average in the white background, and the whole thing is going to look gray and dull. So there's no way to take this photo on any kind of exposure mode other than manual, and you have to, as I say, you have to way overexpose for. Sometimes the term for that kind of intentional misexposure is a proper creative exposure. Well, this was, and here are a few of my photos that I enjoy playing with just at the end. There's enough about me. Here's more about me. This is a picture. I think I have an example of how it was used later in the book, but I was commissioned to do this for a series of book covers, and it's a combination of a photo and Photoshop painting on top of the photo. And there's the dragonfly in action on a book cover. Is this a picture of mountains on a Chinese screen? Well, no. It's actually a segment of a beach. So it's important to look at things flexibly and to see that how you frame them and how you shift them can be very important in creating an image that's interesting. This is the book cover of my book about the Golden Gate Bridge. This is Light and Exposure for Digital Photographers, published by O'Reilly. And there's a lot of good information in this book about how to take pictures. Every picture in the book is captioned with the story of how I made the picture and what exposure settings I used to do it. This is my book about Yosemite. And that's this is up to you. Are there any more questions?
There have been a lot of questions, and I'm not sure we have time to get into all of them, Harold, but people are asking, first of all, there are a lot of questions about the multiple focus points on the various pictures that you took and how to do that. That seems to me like it would be the topic of a separate webcast altogether.
Yes, I think you and I had discussed doing will be a little bit more technical, but doing a webcast on basically hand post-processing in Photoshop, and that would be a place that could very well come up.
Okay.
I mean, the overview there is that what you do is you pick the focus points you want, you shoot the multiple images, you make sure to keep the aperture the same on all the shots, and then you combine them in Photoshop using layers and masking.
Oh, well, that's quite simple.
Yeah, it sounds it, doesn't it?
Yeah. No, it doesn't. And then I just don't know where to pick and choose from the other.
Well, why don't you pick maybe 2 more at random? How does that sound?
Okay. Let's see. This isn't just about your opinion, and Jose's asked it a couple times. What do you think about the new fever around photos taken with the iPhone? And people are saying it's the new Polaroid. But you don't have an iPhone, do you?
No, I don't have an iPhone.
I don't either, so.
I don't have an iPhone. For a while, when I first got it was new then, my mobile phone, I was into taking pictures with it, and it's true, you end up in places with your phone to take photos that you don't have a camera, and I don't mean that just in a naughty way, but it's something you have with you all the time, so you end up taking these photos. I mean, my own aesthetic tends to be that I like images that are really high resolution, and partly that's sort of economic necessity too. As a professional, the art directors who come and use my work or who hire me to do things tend to want images that will be capable of really critical reproduction. So unless they're looking for a specifically iPhone kind of look, and in reality that's something that might even be generated to look that way using a higher resolution camera, it's not something I can use so much professionally. That said, I think that it's really totally cool to play with anything that's photographic. I mean, there are people who like plastic cameras. Diana's, there's this attachment that you can put on a DSLR called a lens baby, and I actually have a bunch of lens babies, and that manages to turn a $1,000 DSLR into something that's basically a camera with a plastic lens. So, you do that for the look, why not use an iPhone? More power to it.
And here's another question. How do you get that white background, the one behind the anemone and the other flower that you took?
Those two photographs were shot on a light box as the background, so that's where the white comes. So that's 50% of the formula. But the other 50% of the formula is what I mentioned when I talked about the image, namely you have to way overexpose it. And that's part of the secret to high-key lit photos, is to way overexpose them. It's also the case that I generally shoot in that kind of situation about 10 exposures with a 10x exposure time on it. When you're going to combine exposures, you need to keep the aperture the same, and I'm almost always stopped all the way down for those photos. But as an example, I might shoot a range from a 20th of a second to a 200th of a second at f32. So, and what I do when I go to work on the photos is I start with the brightest version for the background, the 1/20th of a second, and then I paste in the parts from the darker versions to get the full detail.
Okay. And when you say you're photographing it on a light box, is the light box actually lit?
Yep.
So it backlights
Yep.
the flower. Okay. Wow, interesting. Okay, well, I think we've got a little overtime, and this has been incredible. So if people are saying, please offer post-processing as a webinar, we will. Harold's agreed to do quite a few more this year, and I'm really excited about it. So, watch our site, or if you wanted to get information about our webcast, we'll send you the news about it. And yes, we have recorded this. I will send a link to everyone as soon as the recording's available. I believe it should be by tomorrow, so that'll be great if you missed any of it. You can listen to it again.
Let me also mention that I like to try to answer every email I get that's about photography. So if you have questions, don't hesitate to send me an email. You see an email address up on the screen, as well as my website addresses. So I'm happy to hear from anybody and to try to answer questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Harold, and thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thanks a lot.
All right. Bye-bye.